In a galaxy ruled by ancient empires, where civilizations had conquered stars long before Earth had discovered fire, where fleets the size of solar systems enforced order across millions of worlds, there was one species no one took seriously: humans. They were new, their history barely a footnote, their technology incomplete, their world fragile. To the rest of the galaxy, humanity was not a threat, not a rival, not even an enemy, just a curiosity, something to observe, something to study, something that would either evolve or quietly disappear. When the first signals from Earth reached the stars, they did not spark fear. They sparked laughter. Galactic councils archived the transmissions without concern. Military commanders ignored them completely. Explorers marked the solar system as insignificant, because in a universe where power defined survival, humans appeared to have none. No massive fleets, no ancient knowledge, no overwhelming force, nothing worth fearing. But the galaxy made one mistake. A mistake so fundamental that by the time they realized it, it was already too late. Because humanity did not rely on power the way other species did. They did not measure strength in fleets, or weapons, or territory. They measured it in something far more dangerous. Something that could not be scanned, could not be predicted, could not be understood. Something no empire had ever truly faced before. They thought humans would surrender. They thought humans would break. They thought humans would learn their place. They were wrong. Because this is not the story of how humanity was discovered. This is the story of what happened when the galaxy pushed humanity too far. The first confirmed signal from Earth reached the outer colonies of the galaxy without any real importance. No alarms were triggered, no fleets were mobilized, and no one treated it as anything unusual. It was intercepted by a minor listening station orbiting a forgotten trade route, one of thousands scattered across the stars. The operator on duty, a low-ranking technician from a species that had already witnessed the rise and fall of multiple empires, nearly deleted it without even reviewing the content. To him, it was just another primitive broadcast from a young world trying to announce its existence. However, protocol required that all new civilizations be logged. So the signal was forwarded, not to any military authority or high command, but to an archive where insignificant discoveries were stored and rarely revisited. Within days, analysts reviewed the data, and within weeks, a conclusion was reached and quietly accepted across internal networks. The report labeled humanity as a newly emerging species with early interstellar capability, limited technological advancement, and no meaningful military strength. The final assessment was simple: no threat. That single conclusion spread silently but carried dangerous consequences. It did not create fear or caution. Instead, it created complacency. In the chambers of the Galactic Council, where ancient beings debated matters that shaped entire star systems, humanity was mentioned only briefly. It was described as a developing species located in a peripheral region of space, not significant enough to demand attention or intervention. The discussion ended almost as soon as it began. Among the more aggressive civilizations, however, the reaction took a different form. Where others saw insignificance, they saw opportunity. A small planet with weak defenses and an inexperienced species represented an easy expansion target. To them, Earth was not a risk but a resource waiting to be claimed. Military commanders across distant systems reviewed the data and reached similar conclusions. Earth had no advanced planetary defenses, no powerful fleet formations, and no history of large-scale interstellar warfare. Many commanders didn't even consider it necessary to prepare seriously. In their view, this was not a war that required strategy or caution. It was simply expansion. Even traders and opportunists viewed humanity in the same light. They saw potential labor, untapped resources, and a new market to exploit. No one questioned what humans might become in the future. The only concern was what could be taken from them in the present. Without fear, without urgency, and without fully understanding what they were dealing with, the galaxy made its move. It did not begin with a formal declaration of war. Instead, it started quietly, almost routinely, with a fleet entering human-controlled space without permission. Ships positioned themselves along trade routes, communication systems were overridden, and demands were delivered under the pretense of diplomacy. The message was clear. Humanity was expected to submit, to accept integration into a greater system, and to recognize its place within the established order of the galaxy. To the dominant powers, this was not cruelty but mercy. It was an offer that allowed a weaker species to survive under stronger protection. Most civilizations in history had accepted such offers because they understood the alternative. Resistance almost always led to destruction. The galaxy assumed humanity would make the same choice. They expected quick compliance, minimal resistance, and a smooth transition into control. Instead, humanity refused. The refusal was not loud or dramatic. It was not driven by arrogance or empty threats. It was calm, deliberate, and firm. That alone confused those who received it. To them, it made no sense that a species with so little power would reject an outcome that seemed inevitable. At first, many believed it was simply a misunderstanding, a failure of communication, or a lack of awareness. Additional warnings were sent, this time more direct and less diplomatic. Humanity was told that resistance was illogical, that defeat was certain, and that compliance was the only reasonable option. Yet the response did not change. Humanity still refused. That was the moment when a simple expansion operation began to turn into something far more complicated. Because in a galaxy where every civilization understood the hierarchy of power, where strength dictated survival and weakness ensured submission, humans had done something completely unexpected. They chose to fight. The First War was never meant to be a war. It was planned as a demonstration. A show of force designed to end resistance before it could truly begin. The invading fleet that entered human space was not the largest in the galaxy, but it did not need to be. It was more than enough to overwhelm a young civilization that had barely begun to explore beyond its own system. Their ships were massive, their weapons precise, their tactics perfected over centuries of conquest. Against them, humanity had only a scattered defense network, outdated ships, and no experience fighting a species beyond their own. Everything pointed to a swift and inevitable defeat. At first, it seemed to unfold exactly as expected. Human outposts fell quickly. Orbital defenses were destroyed. Communication lines were disrupted. Several colonies were wiped out within days. From the outside, it looked like the collapse had already begun. But then something changed. Humans did not retreat the way other species did. They did not surrender when defeat became obvious. Instead, they adapted. Small, seemingly insignificant ships began to move unpredictably, striking supply lines instead of frontline forces. Civilian vessels were converted into weapons. Improvised tactics replaced traditional strategy. Where the invaders expected order, they found chaos. Human forces did not fight to win battles. They fought to make every victory cost too much. Every system taken required more resources than it was worth. Every advance was slowed by resistance that refused to disappear. Even when human ships were destroyed, new ones appeared, often redesigned and improved within weeks. The war, which should have ended in months, stretched into years. Losses began to mount, not just in ships, but in time, energy, and morale. The invaders had never faced an opponent that refused to follow the logic of survival. Eventually, after a decade of constant resistance, they made a decision that had rarely been necessary in their history. They withdrew. Officially, the conflict was declared a strategic disengagement. Unofficially, it was the first time they had been forced to abandon a conquest against a species so much weaker than themselves. The galaxy took notice, but not in the way it should have. Most did not see it as a warning. They saw it as an anomaly, a mistake that could be corrected. 20 years later, the Second War began. This time, the attackers came prepared. They had studied human tactics, analyzed every recorded battle, and developed countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize what had made humanity effective in the first conflict. They came with larger fleets, better coordination, and strategies built to eliminate unpredictability. They expected a more difficult campaign. But they still expected to win. What they found instead was something entirely different. Humanity had not spent those 20 years recovering. they had spent them evolving. Their ships were faster, their weapons more precise, and their command structures far more flexible than before. Technologies that did not exist during the First War were now deployed at scale. Defensive systems had been completely redesigned, and offensive capabilities had increased beyond anything the attackers had anticipated. More importantly, humans had learned. They anticipated invasion routes before fleets arrived. They disrupted communication networks in ways that made coordination nearly impossible. In some cases, they turned enemy systems against themselves, creating confusion that spread through entire formations. The attackers had come expecting resistance. They encountered adaptation on a level they could not keep up with. Battles that should have lasted hours were decided in minutes. Entire squadrons disappeared after falling into traps that had been set months in advance. Even when the invaders adjusted, humanity adjusted faster. The war lasted 5 years. It ended the same way as the first, with withdrawal. But this time, the cost was far higher. By the time the Third War was proposed, the galaxy had begun to take humanity more seriously. The third invasion was not driven by arrogance or curiosity. It was driven by necessity. If humanity continued to grow at this rate, they would eventually become something no one could control. So the most powerful military force in the galaxy prepared for war. They did not rush. They spent decades studying every detail of human behavior, every recorded engagement, every piece of technology that had been observed. They built new weapons designed specifically to counter human systems. They developed strategies that accounted for unpredictability. They even recruited individuals who had defected from Earth, hoping to better understand the human mind. When they finally moved, they did so with overwhelming force. The largest fleet ever assembled entered human space with one objective: end it. No prolonged conflict. No drawn-out campaign. Total victory. At the beginning, it seemed possible. Their advance was precise, coordinated, and relentless. Human defenses were pushed back. Several key systems were lost. For a moment, it appeared that the pattern might finally break. Then the pattern repeated. Humanity adapted again. But this time, something was different. The technologies they deployed should not have existed. Ships began appearing and disappearing from sensors without any detectable method of cloaking. Weapons operated in ways that did not match known physical laws. Soldiers equipped with advanced armor systems displayed strength and endurance beyond biological limits. Entire fleets were neutralized by forces that could not be tracked or predicted. The attackers, who had prepared for everything they thought humanity could do, found themselves facing something entirely outside their understanding. The war did not last 10 years. It did not last 5. It ended faster than anyone expected. And when it was over, the result was no longer surprising. Humanity had won again. By this point, the question was no longer whether humans could defend themselves. The question was far more unsettling. How were they getting stronger so quickly? And more importantly, what hadn't they shown yet? By the end of the Third War, the galaxy had stopped laughing at humanity. But they still did not understand them. That uncertainty began to spread quietly at first, hidden beneath official reports and controlled statements. Publicly, leaders spoke with confidence, insisting that humanity's victories were the result of unusual tactics, temporary advantages, or errors in judgment. Privately, however, a very different conversation was taking place. Because the data did not make sense. Each war had followed a pattern that no established model of conflict could explain. Humanity had not only survived against stronger opponents, they had improved at a rate that defied logic. Technologies that should have taken centuries to develop appeared within decades. Strategies evolved faster than any predictive system could track. Every time the galaxy believed it understood human capabilities, those assumptions became outdated. And beneath all of it was a growing suspicion that what had been seen was only a fraction of the truth. Intelligence networks began to focus more closely on human space. Long-range sensors monitored activity within the solar system. Reconnaissance probes were deployed along its borders. Spy operations increased, both physical and digital, in an effort to uncover what humanity might be hiding. What they found only made the situation worse. There were reports of massive construction projects taking place in orbit around Earth and across nearby regions of space. Structures of enormous scale were being built, yet when observed directly, nothing appeared to be there. Sensors detected energy outputs that suggested entire fleets or installations, but visual confirmation showed only empty space. It was as if something existed, but refused to be seen. Further anomalies began to emerge. Energy readings from Earth's moon had increased dramatically over a short period of time, far beyond what any known infrastructure could require. Human vessels were reported traveling to star systems that did not appear on any official galactic charts, suggesting the existence of hidden routes or undiscovered regions known only to them. Attempts to infiltrate human communication networks produced even stranger results. Advanced hacking systems, capable of penetrating the defenses of most civilizations, failed completely. In some cases, the intrusions were not just blocked but redirected, leading operatives through layers of false data designed to mislead and confuse. It became increasingly clear that humans were not only aware of these attempts, but were actively manipulating them. Even older records, long dismissed as errors or anomalies, began to take on new meaning. There had been reports decades earlier of stars exhibiting unnatural behavior near human-controlled regions. A dead star that suddenly showed signs of activity. A planet that appeared fully formed in empty space, then vanished without a trace when approached. Massive structures detected briefly on sensors, only to disappear as if they had never existed. At the time, these incidents had been written off as malfunctions, miscalculations, or natural phenomena that were not yet understood. Now they were being re-examined, and the conclusions were unsettling, because when viewed together, they suggested a pattern, one that implied humanity had been developing technologies far beyond what they had revealed during any of the wars. Technologies capable of hiding entire systems. Technologies capable of manipulating matter, energy, and possibly even space itself. The realization spread slowly, but once it took hold, it was impossible to ignore. The galaxy had not been fighting humanity at its full strength. It had been fighting a version of humanity that was holding back. That idea alone would have been disturbing enough. But what made it truly dangerous was a single statement, recorded during the final stages of the Third War. A human soldier, captured and severely wounded, had spoken to one of the opposing commanders. The interaction had been archived as routine interrogation data, its significance overlooked at the time. Now, it was being replayed across intelligence divisions. The soldier had been asked how humanity continued to win despite overwhelming odds. His answer had been simple. He said that the galaxy believed it had seen what humans were capable of. He said that belief was wrong. And then he added something that no one who heard it could easily forget. They had only seen humans fight when they were forced to defend. They had never seen what humans could do when they chose to attack. That statement changed everything, because it introduced a possibility that no one in the galaxy had seriously considered before. That the wars they had fought were not examples of human power. They were examples of human restraint. And if that was true, then the real question was no longer how strong humanity had become. The real question was far more dangerous. What would happen if they stopped holding back? While the galaxy argued over data, probabilities, and strategic outcomes, humanity carried something far heavier than uncertainty. They carried memory. On Earth, far from the distant debates of alien councils, there were no theories about what the wars had meant. There were no discussions about whether humanity had held back or how advanced their technology had become. There were only names. Entire cities had been rebuilt, but the scars of war had not disappeared. Where once there had been skylines, there were now memorials. Where there had been homes, there were walls of black stone engraved with the identities of those who had never returned. Billions of names. Every one of them a life that had been lost across 3 wars that humanity had never wanted to fight. At the center of one of these memorials stood a woman who had lived through all of it. She had once been a scientist, long before the first invasion. Back then, her work had focused on exploration, on understanding the universe rather than defending against it. She had believed, like many others, that contact with alien civilizations would bring progress, cooperation, and a future beyond conflict. She had been wrong. Now, she was the leader of a unified Earth. And she had paid for that position with everything. Her husband's name was carved into the stone from the First War. He had died during the early days of the invasion, when humanity still believed that surrender might be avoided through negotiation. Her daughter had been a soldier in the Second War, part of a unit that had held a collapsing defense line long enough for civilians to escape. Her son had served aboard a ship during the Third War, one that had never returned from a mission deep in contested space. She stood in silence, looking at their names among millions of others, her hand resting against the cold surface of the memorial. For the galaxy, the wars had been campaigns, conflicts measured in territory and resources. For humanity, they had been survival. Every victory had come at a cost that no report could fully capture. Every adaptation, every technological leap, had been driven not by ambition, but by necessity. Humanity had not evolved because they wanted to dominate. They had evolved because failing to do so meant extinction. That difference mattered, because it defined how they fought. And more importantly, why they fought. A voice behind her broke the silence, informing her that it was time. There were preparations to complete, systems to activate, a message to deliver. She nodded, but for a moment, she did not move. Instead, she spoke quietly, not to anyone present, but to the names in front of her. She said she had tried. She had tried to give the galaxy every opportunity to stop, every chance to choose a different path, every warning that humanity did not want war. But the attacks had continued. Again, and again, and again. Eventually, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. The galaxy would not stop. And if it would not stop, then humanity would have to make it stop. She turned away from the memorial and walked toward the facility where the message would be recorded. The path ahead was clear, even if it was not the one she had ever hoped to take. For decades, humanity had chosen restraint. They had fought defensively, limited their responses, and avoided revealing the full extent of their capabilities. They had rebuilt instead of retaliating, protected instead of conquering, and endured instead of escalating. But restraint had a cost. And humanity had paid it in lives. Now that cost had become too high. Inside the recording chamber, everything was prepared. The system that would carry her message across the galaxy was unlike anything other civilizations possessed. It could reach every inhabited world, every station, every ship, instantly. It had existed for years, hidden, unused, reserved for a moment that humanity had hoped would never come. That moment had arrived. She took her place, the symbol of Earth displayed behind her, not as a show of power, but as a statement of identity. This was not a message from an empire. It was not a declaration of conquest. It was a warning. One final attempt to prevent what came next. As the countdown began, she remained completely still, her expression calm but unyielding. Everything she had lost, everything humanity had endured, had led to this point. There would be no anger in her voice. No hatred. Only certainty. Because this was not about revenge. This was about ending a cycle that had already taken too much. And ensuring that it would never happen again. The transmission began without spectacle. There were no dramatic effects, no overwhelming displays of power, no attempt to intimidate through force. Across the galaxy, screens activated at the exact same moment, overriding local systems with a signal that could not be blocked, delayed, or traced. From the oldest council chambers to the smallest outposts drifting in deep space, every intelligent species received the same message simultaneously. At the center of the broadcast sat a single human. She did not wear armor. She did not stand behind weapons. She simply looked directly into the camera and began to speak. She introduced herself as the representative of Earth, her voice steady, controlled, and completely devoid of fear. There was no hesitation in her tone, no uncertainty in her words. What she said was not a negotiation, and it was not a request. It was a statement. She reminded the galaxy of what had already happened. 3 times in the past 50 years, humanity had been attacked. 3 times they had defended themselves. And 3 times, despite overwhelming odds, they had survived and forced their enemies to withdraw. As she spoke, visual records began to appear alongside her words. Footage from the wars, carefully selected and impossible to deny. Scenes of human cities under bombardment, defensive fleets outmatched but still fighting, civilians taking shelter as entire regions burned. There was no exaggeration, no manipulation, only reality presented without distortion. She did not raise her voice, but the weight behind each word grew heavier. She pointed out that despite these attacks, humanity had never retaliated beyond what was necessary to end the immediate threat. They had not pursued their enemies across the galaxy. They had not attempted to conquer or punish those responsible. Instead, they had chosen restraint, even when that restraint came at an enormous cost. She made it clear that this restraint had been mistaken for weakness. That assumption, she explained, was incorrect. The images changed. What replaced them was something the galaxy had never seen before. Structures of immense scale appeared in orbit around Earth, systems that had remained hidden from every form of detection until that moment. Entire networks of platforms, energy arrays, and vessels existed where sensors had previously reported empty space. It was not an illusion. It was a revelation. For decades, humanity had been building. Quietly, carefully, deliberately. Not for conquest, but for preparation. She explained that humanity had hoped such preparation would never be necessary. That each conflict had been met with the expectation that it would be the last. That eventually, the pattern of aggression would end. It had not. Her tone shifted slightly, not into anger, but into something colder. More precise. She stated that intelligence reports indicated preparations for another invasion were already underway. Fleets were being assembled. Strategies were being discussed. Plans were being made, just as they had been before every previous war. This time, she said, the outcome would be different. Not because humanity had changed its values, but because it had reached its limit. She paused, allowing the silence to carry the weight of what would come next. Then she delivered the message that would echo across the galaxy long after the transmission ended. This was the final warning. Any further act of aggression against humanity or its allies would not be met with a defensive response. It would not be contained. It would not be limited. It would be met with absolute destruction. As those words settled, the broadcast shifted again. The galaxy was shown what Earth's system actually looked like, not as it had been perceived through external sensors, but as it truly existed. Defensive networks surrounded every planet. Massive energy systems orbited the sun. Shipyards operated at a scale that exceeded anything previously recorded. Everything had been hidden. Until now. She clarified that humanity did not want war. That they had never wanted it. That every action they had taken over the past 50 years had been aimed at avoiding escalation, not provoking it. But avoidance had failed. And if forced to choose between survival and restraint, humanity would choose survival. Boys. The final part of the message was not directed at any single species. It was addressed to the galaxy as a whole. A decision had to be made. In a fixed amount of time, humanity would demonstrate a small portion of what it was capable of. Any civilization that wished to observe could send representatives to a set of coordinates that were now being transmitted along with the broadcast. What they would witness, she explained, would remove any remaining doubt. It would show clearly what humanity could do when it was no longer focused on minimizing damage, protecting infrastructure, or preserving life. She ended the message with a simple instruction. Choose carefully. Because the next action taken by the galaxy would determine what happened next. The transmission ended instantly. No fade. No delay. Just silence. And across the stars, for the first time in recorded history, an entire galaxy found itself uncertain about what to do next. The silence that followed the transmission did not last long. Across the galaxy, it was replaced by noise. Not the noise of battle or movement, but of argument. Communication channels that had remained stable for centuries became overloaded within minutes. Emergency sessions were called. Secure networks were activated. Leaders who had not spoken directly in decades began exchanging messages with urgency that bordered on panic. For the first time in living memory, the galaxy was not united by power. It was divided by uncertainty. In the Central Council chamber, representatives from the most influential civilizations gathered under heightened security. The atmosphere was tense in a way that few present had ever experienced. These were beings who had overseen the rise and fall of entire species, who had made decisions that reshaped star systems, who had never needed to question their understanding of power. Now they were questioning everything. The debate began immediately, and it fractured along predictable lines. Some dismissed the transmission outright. They argued that humanity was exaggerating its capabilities, using psychological tactics to create fear where none was justified. According to this view, the display of hidden structures and advanced systems was nothing more than selective revelation, carefully designed to manipulate perception. If humanity truly possessed overwhelming power, they would have used it already. The fact that they had not was presented as proof that such power did not exist. Others disagreed. They pointed to the data, to the anomalies that had been recorded over decades, to the inconsistencies that had never been fully explained. They argued that humanity's restraint was not evidence of weakness, but evidence of control. That the patterns now being recognized suggested a deliberate effort to hide capabilities until absolutely necessary. For them, the transmission did not introduce a new threat. It confirmed one that had already been present. Between these two positions stood a third group. They did not claim certainty. They did not assume deception or accept everything at face value. Instead, they focused on probability. They analyzed energy signatures from the broadcast, examined the revealed structures, and compared them to existing technological limits. Their conclusions were cautious but deeply concerning. While not all of humanity's claims could be verified, enough evidence existed to suggest that their capabilities exceeded previous estimates by a significant margin. The disagreement was not simply about what humanity could do. It was about how to respond. Proposals were made, each more extreme than the last. Some argued for immediate action, suggesting that if humanity truly possessed such power, it needed to be neutralized before it could be used. They proposed long-range attacks, coordinated strikes designed to eliminate human systems before any response could be initiated. Others warned that such action could trigger exactly what humanity had threatened. If the demonstration was genuine, any aggressive move might not weaken humanity, but instead provoke a response that no one could survive. Diplomatic options were also discussed. Attempts to open direct communication, to negotiate terms, to de-escalate before the situation moved beyond control. But even these suggestions were met with resistance. Some questioned whether diplomacy was still possible after 3 wars. Others argued that engaging with humanity on equal terms would validate their position and undermine existing power structures. As the debate continued, intelligence reports began to arrive in real time. Reconnaissance units monitoring the coordinates provided in the transmission detected unusual activity. The star system selected for the demonstration, previously classified as inactive, was showing signs of change. Energy levels were increasing in ways that did not match any known natural process. Sensors recorded fluctuations that suggested large-scale manipulation of matter and energy, but the exact nature of what was happening could not be determined. The data only intensified the division. For those already inclined to believe humanity's warning, it was confirmation that something significant was about to occur. For those who remained skeptical, it was interpreted as further evidence of deception, a staged event designed to reinforce the illusion of power. In military command centers across multiple civilizations, preparations began quietly. Fleets were repositioned, defensive systems activated, contingency plans reviewed. No official declaration was made, but the possibility of conflict was no longer theoretical. At the same time, other groups made a different decision. They chose to observe. They would send representatives to the demonstration, not as an act of trust, but as a necessity. Without direct observation, any decision made would be based on incomplete information. And in a situation where the potential consequences were this high, acting without certainty was a risk few were willing to take. The decision fractured the galaxy even further. Some would attend. Some would prepare for war. Some would attempt negotiation. And some would do all three at once. As the session finally came to a close, no unified response had been reached. The alliances that had once defined galactic order were no longer aligned. Each civilization would act according to its own judgment, its own fears, and its own interpretation of what humanity had revealed. But as representatives departed and systems returned to relative quiet, one fact remained impossible to ignore. The demonstration was coming, and whatever humanity chose to show would determine everything that followed. The countdown began the moment the transmission ended. 72 standard hours. That was the time humanity had given the galaxy to decide how it would respond, but as the hours passed, it became clear that no decision would come easily. Instead of clarity, the deadline created pressure, and with that pressure came something the galaxy was not used to feeling: uncertainty. Across countless star systems, movement began almost immediately. Fleets that had once remained in fixed positions started to shift toward the coordinates that had been provided. Some traveled openly, their intentions clear. Others moved cautiously, using indirect routes and masked signatures, unwilling to reveal too much before they understood what they were approaching. The system chosen for the demonstration had long been classified as dead. Its central star had burned out millions of years earlier, leaving behind a cold, dark remnant surrounded by lifeless planets and drifting debris. It was the kind of place that served no strategic value, a forgotten corner of space that no civilization had reason to revisit. Now, it had become the most important location in the galaxy. Long-range sensors began monitoring it continuously, feeding data back to command centers light years away. At first, the readings were subtle. Minor fluctuations in energy output, slight distortions in gravitational fields. Nothing that could not be explained by natural processes or sensor interference. But as time passed, the changes became impossible to ignore. The dead star was no longer stable. Energy levels began to rise in a steady, controlled pattern. Not randomly, not chaotically, but with precision that suggested intent. The increase was gradual, almost careful, as if something was adjusting the system step by step, fine-tuning conditions for a purpose that no one could yet define. Observers struggled to interpret the data. Stars did not behave this way. They did not simply regain energy. They did not restart themselves after millions of years of inactivity. Every known model of stellar physics failed to explain what was being recorded. And yet, the evidence was there. The system was changing. Not naturally. Deliberately. As more fleets arrived at the edge of the system, strict distance protocols were observed, not out of trust in humanity's warning, but out of caution. No one wanted to be closer than necessary. The unknown had replaced confidence, and even the most powerful commanders understood that approaching without understanding could be a fatal mistake. Ships from dozens of species gathered, forming a silent perimeter around the system. Some maintained communication with each other, sharing sensor data and attempting to build a clearer picture of what was happening. Others remained isolated, choosing to rely only on their own instruments and analysis. Despite their differences, all of them were watching the same thing. And none of them understood it. As the hours continued to pass, the transformation accelerated. The once dead star began to emit light, faint at first, then gradually intensifying. It was not a sudden ignition, not an explosion of energy, but a controlled reactivation, as if the star itself was being rebuilt from the inside out. Planets within the system showed signs of change as well. Gravitational readings shifted. Orbital paths adjusted slightly, aligning in ways that suggested external influence. Even the distribution of debris within the system began to reorganize, forming patterns that could not be explained by natural forces. Every new data point added to the same conclusion. Something was preparing this system. And whatever was doing it had a level of control that exceeded anything the galaxy had ever encountered. As the final hours approached, tension reached a level that no formal meeting or debate could contain. There were no more arguments about whether the demonstration would happen. That question had already been answered. The only question that remained was far more important. What exactly were they about to witness? At the edge of the system, one human vessel appeared. It did not arrive with a fleet. It did not announce itself with force. It simply entered the observation zone and held position. Compared to the ships surrounding it, It was unremarkable in size and design. It carried no visible weapons, no obvious defenses, nothing that suggested it was capable of threatening the massive fleets observing from a distance. But the presence of that single ship was enough to shift the atmosphere completely. Because every system, every sensor, every analysis pointed to the same conclusion. Whatever was about to happen was going to come from that ship. And there was nothing anyone present could do to stop it. The final seconds of the countdown passed in complete silence. Across hundreds of ships, from dozens of civilizations, every sensor was focused on a single point. No one spoke. No one moved. Entire command crews stood frozen, waiting for something they could not define, but knew would change everything. At the center of it all, the human vessel remained still. Then, without warning, it acted. A single object was released from the ship. It was small. So small that many sensors initially failed to register it as anything significant. There was no visible propulsion system, no energy signature that matched known weaponry, no indication that it posed any threat. At first, confusion spread through the observing fleets. Analysts searched for patterns, trying to identify the purpose of what had just been launched. Some assumed it was a probe. Others believed it was a decoy, a distraction meant to draw attention away from something larger. But as the object moved toward the star, that confusion began to shift. Because it was moving in a way that should not have been possible. It was not accelerating. It was not following a trajectory influenced by gravity. It simply crossed the distance at a speed that defied every known method of travel, as if space itself was adjusting to allow its passage. By the time the first accurate readings were processed, it was already too late to analyze its path. The object reached the star. And then, something happened that no one present could fully describe. There was no explosion, no flash of energy, no visible impact. For a fraction of a moment, it seemed as if nothing had occurred at all. Then reality itself appeared to hesitate. Sensors across every ship began reporting conflicting data. Light behaved unpredictably. Gravitational fields fluctuated without pattern. Instruments that had functioned flawlessly for centuries suddenly returned readings that made no sense. At the center of the system, the star began to change. Not violently, not destructively, but fundamentally. Its structure shifted in ways that could not be explained by physics. Layers that should have remained stable began to fold inward, not collapsing, but reorganizing. Energy patterns reformed, matter redistributed, and the entire composition of the star started to transform into something that did not match any known classification. Observers struggled to interpret what they were seeing, because it was not destruction. It was control. The effect spread outward from the star in a perfectly contained wave. As it reached the nearest planet, the same process began. The surface did not crack or explode. Instead, it dissolved, breaking down into smaller and smaller components, transitioning from solid matter to energy, and then into a state that sensors could not properly identify. One by one, the planets of the system followed. Not destroyed. Converted. Every object within the system, from the largest gas giants to the smallest fragments of debris, underwent the same transformation. Matter ceased to exist in its original form, replaced by patterns of information that no known technology should have been able to produce, let alone control. Across the observing fleets, silence turned into shock. Entire worlds were disappearing, not in chaos, but with precision. Within a matter of minutes, the system that had once contained multiple planets, moons, and structures was reduced to something unrecognizable. Where there had been mass and form, there was now only a complex field of energy and data, held in a state that defied every known law of reality. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the process stopped. For a brief moment, nothing moved. And then it began again. A second release from the human vessel triggered the next phase. The field that now contained the system's converted matter shifted, reorganizing itself with the same level of precision that had defined its transformation. Slowly, shapes began to return. Planets reappeared. But they were not the same. Each world was reconstructed with exact symmetry, its structure refined, its composition optimized. Atmospheres formed with perfect balance. Orbital paths adjusted into stable, efficient patterns. Moons appeared in positions that enhanced gravitational stability rather than disrupting it. The system was being rebuilt, not as it had been, but as something better. What would have taken natural processes billions of years to achieve was completed in a matter of hours. Every detail, from the arrangement of planetary systems to the internal composition of each world, was controlled with absolute precision. When it was over, the system looked almost unchanged at a glance. But every scan, every measurement, every analysis confirmed the truth. It had been completely redesigned. The human vessel transmitted a single message across all channels. What had just been witnessed, it explained, was not a weapon. It was a tool. A system used for large-scale construction and environmental restructuring. A method of rebuilding damaged regions of space, of restoring what had been lost, and of creating stable systems where none had existed before. There was a brief pause. Then came the part that no one present could ignore. If such a process were applied without the constraints of precision, without the intention to preserve, without the limitation of control, it would not rebuild. It would erase. The transmission ended. And across the observing fleets, no one spoke. Because for the first time, every civilization present understood the same thing at the exact same moment. Humanity had not shown them a weapon. They had shown them something far more dangerous. The ability to decide whether anything should exist at all. For a long time, no one moved. Across the fleets gathered at the edge of the system, command decks remained frozen in silence. Officers stared at their displays, not because they were waiting for new data, but because they did not know how to process what they had already seen. Every system was still running. Every sensor was still active. But none of it made sense anymore. The models that had guided galactic civilization for thousands of years had just been broken in a matter of hours. Because what humanity had demonstrated was not simply advanced technology. It was control at a level no one had believed was possible. Entire worlds had been taken apart, reduced beyond matter itself, and then rebuilt with precision that exceeded natural perfection. Not a single fragment had been lost. Not a single error had been detected. The process had not just worked. It had worked flawlessly. And that was the most terrifying part. Because perfection meant intention. It meant that nothing that had happened was accidental, uncontrolled, or experimental. Every stage had been calculated. Every outcome had been planned. Humanity had not risked failure. They had eliminated it. Across the fleets, the implications spread quickly. If a single vessel could do this to an entire solar system, then scale was no longer a limitation. Distance was no longer a defense. Numbers were no longer an advantage. The strategies that had defined warfare for generations suddenly became irrelevant. There was no formation that could survive it. No shield that could block it. No retreat that could escape it. For the first time in recorded history, war itself no longer had meaning in the way the galaxy understood it. Because this was not war. This was control over existence. Commanders who had once spoken with absolute confidence now found themselves unable to give orders. What strategy could be formed against an opponent that could rewrite reality itself? What plan could account for a force that did not need to destroy in order to win? Even those who had argued that humanity was bluffing could no longer maintain that position. The evidence was undeniable, not because of what had been said, but because of what had been shown. This was real. And it had always been real. That realization led to an even more disturbing conclusion. Humanity had possessed this capability long before the demonstration. Long before the Third War. Long before the Second. Possibly even before the First. Which meant that every conflict the galaxy had initiated, every attack, every invasion, had taken place against an opponent that had chosen not to use its full power. The silence that filled the fleets was no longer confusion. It was understanding. Slow, heavy, and impossible to ignore. They had not been fighting for survival against humanity. Humanity had been choosing not to end them. Across multiple command channels, the same question began to appear, spoken quietly, almost reluctantly, as if saying it out loud made it more real. But why would a species with that level of power allow itself to be attacked? Why would it endure losses, sacrifice entire populations, and fight prolonged wars when it could have ended everything in moments? The answer was not in the data. It was in the pattern. Humanity had not been acting out of weakness. They had been acting out of restraint. They had limited their responses. They had avoided escalation. They had preserved their enemies when they could have erased them. Not because they had to. Because they chose to. That distinction changed everything. Because it meant the demonstration was not a threat born from aggression. It was a boundary. A line that had been drawn after every other option had failed. And now, that line had been made visible to the entire galaxy. Across the fleets, orders began to shift. Weapons systems powered down. Attack formations dissolved. Communication channels reopened, not for coordination of battle, but for reassessment. For the first time, the dominant powers of the galaxy were not planning how to win. They were deciding how to avoid losing everything. At the edge of the system, the human vessel remained where it was, unchanged, silent, and completely still. It did not pursue. It did not threaten. It did not need to, because the message had already been delivered. And this time, it had been understood. The change did not happen all at once. There was no single moment where the galaxy collectively agreed to stop fighting, no official declaration that marked the end of conflict. Instead, the shift unfolded gradually, quietly, almost reluctantly, as if entire civilizations were trying to adjust to a reality they had not been prepared to face. The fleets that had gathered for the demonstration began to withdraw. Not in formation, not with coordinated intent, but individually, each civilization choosing its own path away from the system. There were no final exchanges, no closing statements, no attempts to reassert dominance. The silence that had followed the demonstration remained, stretching across the void as ships turned away from the only place where certainty had been replaced by something far more powerful. Understanding. Across the galaxy, military commands were the first to react. In strategic centers that had once been filled with plans for expansion and conquest, new orders began to circulate. Invasion scenarios were archived, then removed entirely. Offensive doctrines that had been refined over centuries were no longer relevant. There was no point in planning a war that could not be fought. Instead, attention shifted to defense. Not against humanity's immediate action, but against the possibility of ever provoking it again. Fleet deployments were adjusted, not to project strength, but to avoid unnecessary proximity to human-controlled space. Border systems were redefined, giving Earth and its surrounding regions a wide margin of separation. Trade routes were recalculated to bypass areas that had once been considered strategically valuable, now viewed as zones of unacceptable risk. It was not fear alone that drove these changes. It was calculation. For the first time, the cost of aggression had become absolute. And no rational civilization was willing to pay it. In political structures across multiple species, similar shifts began to take place. Leaders who had built their power on expansion and dominance found themselves facing populations that no longer supported those ambitions. The demonstration had not just changed strategic thinking. It had changed perception. Power was no longer defined by the ability to conquer. It was defined by the ability to choose not to. Some civilizations adapted quickly. They reduced their military presence, redirected resources toward internal development, and began exploring alternatives to the systems that had defined them for generations. Others struggled, attempting to maintain old hierarchies in a universe where those hierarchies no longer made sense. A few resisted entirely. They dismissed what had happened, either out of denial or desperation, continuing to pursue technologies and strategies that might one day challenge humanity. But even among these groups, there was hesitation. The certainty that had once driven their actions was gone, replaced by doubt that could not be ignored. Meanwhile, in regions that had been devastated by conflict, something unexpected began to emerge. Stability. Without constant warfare, systems that had once been battlegrounds had the opportunity to recover. Trade resumed along safer routes. Independent worlds, long caught between larger powers, began to establish their own identities without fear of immediate conquest. For the first time in recorded history, the number of active conflicts across the galaxy began to decline. Not because peace had been negotiated, but because war had become impractical. Humanity, for its part, did not expand into this new space. They did not claim territory. They did not demand allegiance. They did not attempt to reshape the galaxy in their image. Instead, they withdrew. Their presence remained where it had always been, centered around Earth and the systems they had already developed. The same technologies that had been revealed during the demonstration continued to operate, but only within human-controlled regions. There were no further displays, no additional warnings, no reinforcement of the message that had already been delivered. It was not necessary, because the demonstration had not been forgotten. In fact, it became something else entirely. A reference point. A moment that redefined what was possible and what was not. Across academic institutions, research centers, and cultural archives, the event was studied, analyzed, and debated. Not to replicate it, because that remained far beyond reach, but to understand its implications. Some civilizations began to change in response. A small number chose to abandon military expansion entirely, redirecting their efforts toward cooperation and development. Others explored technologies focused on sustainability, healing, and reconstruction, inspired not by what humanity had said, but by what they had shown. The idea that power could exist without domination began to take root. Slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. At the same time, a different kind of awareness spread across the galaxy. An understanding that somewhere, beyond the boundaries of everyday conflict and competition, there existed a species capable of enforcing limits that could not be challenged. Not through rule, not through control, but through the simple certainty that if those limits were ignored, the consequences would be final. This awareness did not create unity, but it created restraint. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. In the years that followed, the galaxy continued to change. Not because it was forced to, but because it had been shown something it could no longer ignore. For thousands of years, power had been simple. It was measured in fleets, in weapons, in the ability to take and hold territory. Every civilization understood that strength meant dominance, and survival meant becoming stronger than those around you. That belief had shaped everything. It had driven expansion. It had justified conflict. It had defined progress itself. Humanity did not destroy that system. They made it irrelevant, because what they revealed was not just greater power, but a different understanding of it. They showed that the ability to dominate was not the highest form of strength. That true power was not measured by how much you could take, but by how much you could choose not to take. That idea spread slowly, but it spread. Across distant systems, civilizations that had once defined themselves by conquest began to reconsider what they valued. Some changed out of fear, recognizing that the old way of doing things no longer worked. Others changed out of understanding, realizing that they had been given a chance to become something better. Not all of them accepted it. Some resisted, holding on to the belief that power must be challenged, that no force should exist beyond opposition. But even among them, the certainty was gone. The demonstration had introduced a limit that could not be ignored, and that limit shaped every decision that followed. At the center of it all, humanity remained unchanged. They did not claim victory. They did not demand recognition. They did not attempt to lead. They simply continued. They rebuilt their worlds, advanced their technology, and lived their lives without seeking to control others. The same species that had demonstrated the ability to reshape entire systems chose instead to focus on something far smaller and far more important: their own existence. For many across the galaxy, that was the most difficult part to understand. Why possess such power and not use it? Why hold the ability to rule everything and choose not to? The answer was not found in their technology. It was found in their nature. Humanity had never been the strongest. They had never been the most advanced. They had never been the fastest or the most efficient. What made them different was something far less measurable. They endured. They adapted. They refused to stop. Every loss became a reason to improve. Every failure became a step forward. Every threat became a challenge to overcome. Where other species calculated outcomes and accepted limits, humans pushed beyond them. Not because they believed they would win, but because they refused to accept defeat. That was the force the galaxy had failed to recognize. Not their weapons. Not their fleets. Their will. A force that could not be scanned, predicted, or contained. A force that did not depend on technology, but used it as an extension of something deeper. Something that had allowed them to survive when they should have fallen, to grow when they should have stagnated, and to rise when every logical outcome said they should not. In the end, that was what the galaxy learned. You could destroy human ships. You could take human worlds. But you could not break what made them human. Because as long as even one of them remained, the process would begin again. They would rebuild. They would adapt. They would return stronger than before. And that made them something no empire had ever truly faced. Not an enemy, but a certainty. A reminder that power alone does not decide the outcome of conflict. That victory does not belong to those who appear strongest. It belongs to those who refuse to stay down. For the first time in its history, the galaxy understood that truth. And in that understanding, it was given a choice. To continue as it always had, repeating the same cycles of conflict and destruction. Or to change. To build instead of conquer. To cooperate instead of dominate. To grow without forcing others to fall. Humanity had already made its choice. The question was whether the rest of the galaxy would do the same. Because now, for the first time, there was something greater than power shaping the future. There was consequence. And somewhere among the stars, a species existed that had the strength to enforce it. And the wisdom to choose when not to.